All right, so we've been on this great journey through the book of Genesis over the last several weeks. And as you all know, Genesis means beginnings. And Genesis 1 through 11, which has been our focus until now, is really what we often call the prehistory of Israel. So in some ways, those 11 chapters are great theological narratives that tell the story of the origins of humanity, but they're not rooted in concrete historical times in the same way that we begin to experience in Genesis 12. So in some ways, as we begin chapter 12 tonight, we're really entering into the second part of the book of Genesis. So this is the beginning of the ancestors and their stories, Israel's ancestors. So if you begin, and I suggested that you read from around chapter 12 last week to around 24 or 25, so about 12 chapters of Genesis. And if you did that, then you probably got some introduction to the stories of Abraham and Sarah in the book of Genesis. And I always, so when I mentioned we're in the historical era now, most scholars date Abraham somewhere in the era of 1800 BC. Whereas before Abraham, we really don't have a concrete date. One quick note about, we looked at the flood stories. The flood stories talk about the mountains of Ararat, not mountain, a singular in the Hebrew. And those mountains are a known mountain range in, I think it's southeastern Turkey, but they also extend over into the country surrounding the edge of Turkey. So those mountains were probably some of the tallest mountains known to the Israelites as the stories were being handed down. So they're a good setting for the resting place for the ark when it finally lands. But aside from that, in a sense, and the references early in Genesis to the rivers and then the spread of nations, now we start getting concrete individuals like Abram associated with concrete places. So Abram was in Ur of Chaldea, which is modern-day Iraq, and journeyed with his father to Haran, which is circling to the north and west of Ur. And from there, God will call Abram to leave and to go to a land that God will show him. So he will go south into the land of Canaan, which will become Israel, God's holy land, as it were. So as you were reading, I always like to start this way, as you were reading through this text, for those of you who read, what struck you? Or what questions did it raise in your minds?
It struck me that the only thing more dangerous than being a pretty woman at that time would be being married to a pretty woman.
Yes, okay, yes. Some very interesting texts. And there's actually 3 separate texts in the book of Genesis that are kind of the same story told over and over again. So about someone pretending that their wife is their sister. Abraham did it twice, or Abram, and then Isaac also did it. So to the same king. The king might have figured it out by then, but anyway. Other things that struck you.
That God chose flaky people from the start.
Okay, God chose flaky people from the start, yes. Yeah, it is very interesting that in the ancestral narratives, these are the great heroes of God's people of faith, that they don't hesitate also to share the stories of their failures. It's very revealing. You know, they don't mind showing the weakness of the ones that God calls.
Women really were like owned, like we read about so-and-so had this son, and then this son had this son, and this son and this son, and then they had some other sons and daughters. And, you know, it's kind of like, I know that eventually there are books, you know, that have a woman's name or whatever, but at least back then, I mean, he was willing to in order to spare his wife, it's kind of like, okay, just pretend you're my sister, and then the Pharaoh goes and takes her as a wife and whatever, and he'd rather do that than
Get
have,
killed.
know that he's married to a beautiful woman or something like that. So it's almost like they really were not first-class citizens at all.
Yeah, you are definitely onto the theme, which is that ancient cultures, including Israel, were definitely what we would call patriarchal cultures. And so, yes, men have primacy of place in those cultures, and it was the father of the house that had the power, as it were. So, although, that said, when you read through the whole set of stories, you also begin to see how God also uses women in very profound ways throughout the narrative. So, you know, God is always surprising us with undermining the structures of power that we humans set up. That's the other little strange piece of the puzzle over and over again.
What struck me, Father, was the way they talk back to God. You know,
Yes.
like they carry on a conversation and they say things that if I was in front of God, I wouldn't question. I mean, they question him.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Are you thinking of that famous scene where Abram is kind of trying to talk God out of destroying the city if some innocent people are found in it? Yeah. I'm just dust and ashes, God, but you know, let me appeal to you one more time. Yeah.
But you also see that when Sarah's laughing in the tent and then
I did
denies
not
that
laugh.
she didn't. Yeah, and yes, you did. You know.
Yes,
So
yes. These dialogues that you have with God, yeah, very. It's interesting. One person observed that in the beginning of the scriptures, God is very intimate and present in a lot of different ways. And as time progresses, God becomes more and more removed from the active affairs of humanity. It seems in the way it's depicted. But yeah, definitely in Genesis you get these ongoing dialogues with God. And God showing up in angelic form, these mysterious visitors who show up. Other things that struck you when you're reading about Abram and Sarah?
I really was marveling at Ishmael and Isaac and how those paths of those two boys were laid out, and that the Lord's promise was very focused on Isaac, but he didn't forsake Ishmael
Right.
and protected him along the way. But it was funny, he called him, he was going to be an ass of a man or something like that. He was
wild
gonna have
ass.
wild ass,
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
So, and then, you kind of wonder about like how the nations have evolved since then, and,
Yeah, but the stories of those conflicts in tensions and families are also on vivid display. And the importance of having offspring. Of course, the promise of God to Abram was that he would have offspring. And yet he and Sarah remained barren until. Yeah, it's interesting God makes this promise, your offspring will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, but he doesn't have a single child yet at that point. So it's a big promise without a lot of concrete results yet when it starts being made.
I think it was interesting to see that no one really spoke the same language. We had people from all over coming together, and trying to work things out.
So are you thinking of a particular episode? Are you thinking of Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel?
How they were able to get together and agree to anything.
Oh, in terms of like where you're going to put your flocks and my flocks and that sort of thing. It's very interesting, and meeting people along the way, the kings of other nations. Yeah, Abram he's quite an interesting figure. I think it's fair to say that until Moses, Abraham towers as the greatest figure in the memory of Israel. All right, let's then take a look. Let's dive into a few of the narratives then. Have a good overview kind of taste. And let's go to Genesis chapter 12. And we'll do verses, let's do verses 1 to 4. Someone want to read that for us?
I'll do it. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from the land of your kinsfolk and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. All the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you." Abram went as the Lord directed him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran.
Okay, so here the key element of the narrative here is God's call. So it's the initiative or the primacy of God. And remember that this happens, the previous narrative episode is the Tower of Babel. So humanity came together to try to build this tower to storm heaven, and their pride led them to Babel, to no longer being able to communicate with each other. So you have this picture of humanity scattered over the face of the earth, unable to communicate with each other. And God's next intervention is to call Abram. And it's a call for Abram basically to leave his homeland behind and go to the land that I will show you. And someone made the observation, Abraham knew that he was following God because he didn't know where he was going. So that's an interesting thing. It required on Abraham's part a remarkable act of faith. Now at this point he's still called Abram, and Sarah is still called Sarai, and both of them will have their name changed at a decisive point in the narrative. So, but it's interesting here, what does the Lord say in verse 2? I will make of you a great nation. So that promise, Abram, you're going to be a great nation. Later God will say, I'm going to make you the father of nations, in the plural, so that the promise will be expanded. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So what is the purpose that God has in mind when he calls Abraham to himself? It's that Abram and God's people in the long run will be a blessing for all humanity. So this is not meant in, God did not choose Abram, nor did he choose a beloved people so that the rest of the human condition would be left alone or bereft. But God's intention was to have a blessing extend through Abraham. So that's the theology contained right here at the beginning. So I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you. And that can be translated that way. It can also be translated that all the communities of the earth will bless themselves in the name of Abraham. So, but the deeper theology behind it is the very purpose of God's election or call of Abram and Sarah will be that the communities of the earth will now find blessing. So that's the big picture of what God is doing. And that's an apt introduction to all the narratives that we read about Abram and his wife Sarah. So it's interesting though, because Abram, one of the key sub-figures in the whole story, of course, is Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham and the son of his brother. And so Abram, and notice in verse 5, Abram took his wife Sarai, his brother's son Lot, all the possessions that they had accumulated and the persons they had acquired in Haran. So Abram, at this point, was already the head of the household. So he had a great assembly of people who went with him, servants and so forth. So he's got his household, he's got servants, he's got he's got livestock, he's a shepherd, so he's traveling with a whole bunch of stuff. So think of a nomadic lifestyle here. And they set out for the land of Canaan. So the land of Canaan will become the land of promise. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the sacred place at Shechem. So they're looking toward future events. So foreshadowing of Joshua, the time when the covenant will be renewed, for example, at Shechem. By the terebinth of Moreh. You hear, by the way, a lot about terebinths. So they're very big trees, and these trees are like trees of symbolic import. So they often refer to a terebinth in a certain location, especially the ones near Hebron and Mamre. And then the Lord, verse 7, appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. If you read through the ancestral stories about Abram, God makes two big basic promises to Abraham. What are those two big promises?
That he will have descendants.
Are descendants, and as numerous as, there's two kind of phrases that come back again and again.
Stars,
Yeah,
sand.
numerous as the stars of the sky and as the dust of the earth.
Yeah.
What's the second great promise?
The covenant.
Or the covenant is not so much a promise, it's a covenant of promise, but it's a promise. Abraham, I'm going to give you
Land.
this land.
Yeah.
Yeah, this land will be yours and your descendants. So, what God will do for Abram is make him the father of a multitude, and he will also give him a place, a land. So those are the great gifts or promises to Abraham in Genesis. And for Israel, those will be two of the most important blessings of life, having your own homeland and your descendants after you. And remember I said a few weeks ago that they didn't have a clear conception of heaven for human beings when we died. We went down to Sheol, so the blessings of God are primarily blessings in this life. And those would be that you would live on in your descendants, and that you would have the land, that your ancestral lands that would belong to you and to your family.
Is Canaan in modern day Israel?
Yes. Yeah. So the land of Canaan is basically Israel and Palestine today. So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. You'll also find that Abram begins to build altars. Remember, Noah was the first person to build an altar. You're going to find that whenever Abram goes to a new place, he often builds an altar to the Lord, and it's often by one of the terebinths. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel, pitching his tent with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. He built an altar there to the Lord and invoked the Lord by name. Then Abram journeyed on by stages to the Negev. So that's moving you south in the direction of Egypt. Now the next section is something that you all have already referred to, which is Abram's arrival in Egypt. It's interesting, for the people of Israel, what's their greatest memory about Egypt? Yeah, being in slavery for 400 years. So they will be enslaved for 400 years there. So in a sense, when Abram goes down to Egypt, he is doing a dress rehearsal. So for Israel, they're saying, well, yeah, our father Abram also went down there before we were enslaved for 400 years. So Abram is kind of the foreshadowing figure of what will later happen to God's people. And in the New Testament, this is a forward look to Christianity. Jesus will go back to Egypt as a child so that he can come out of Egypt and relive the experience of God's people. So there are these great links that go forward and backward in time with Egypt, before the Exodus and afterward.
There's a mention here where Abram's dialoguing with God, and God's telling him this is going to happen to your descendants.
A prophecy, yes. And God is telling Abram before the fact, this is going to happen. All right, so yeah, let's do that little episode here in verses 10 through 20. Someone want to read that for us?
Now there was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there. The famine was severe in the land. He was about to enter Egypt. He said to Sarah, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful to behold. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life will be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, donkeys, maid servants, she-donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So they took her as my wife. Now that here is your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave him orders concerning him, and he set him on the way with his wife and all that he had.
All right, so it's interesting. You see the dress rehearsal elements with this trip to Egypt. So what are the parallels with the Exodus? Why did Abraham go down to Egypt to begin with?
Famine.
Great famine, and that's why they go to Egypt, because there's a famine in the land, and Joseph is already down there. He's been sold into slavery. Then a severe famine broke out, and they go to Egypt to find rations. So Abram is in a way doing a dress rehearsal. Also, you notice the other little, in verse 17, there were severe plagues. That foreshadows the 10 great plagues that God will use before Egypt will let Israel leave the land of Egypt. And those plagues in the time of the Exodus are kind of God's way of saying, you know, Pharaoh, let go, let my people go. And here, they're kind of a way of giving Pharaoh a warning, hey, this is Abram's wife you've got there, not his sister. So what do you think about Abram's integrity in this chapter?
Less questionable.
He's a liar, isn't he? Yeah. It's so interesting that that they don't mind. And again, we're talking about showing the dark side of our great figures of the scriptures. You know, Abraham's lying, and he's lying because he's trying to save himself. You know, he doesn't care what happens to Sarai. You know, she can go be with one of those Egyptians, but I'm not going to be in trouble because of it. So, you know, he basically exposes her to that vulnerability. Now, fast forward ahead real quick to Genesis chapter 20.
Yeah, isn't this where, wasn't she really kind of his half-sister?
Yeah, so that's what we find out in chapter 20.
Yeah.
We find out that chapter 20 gives you a little, Abraham will explain a little further on, like, well, she really is my sister.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
sort of a little white lie or half
Right,
lie.
a little sort of half lie, yes. But you don't know that based on chapter 12. You only find that out in chapter 20, when Abraham does it again with a different king. So chapter 20, it's an interesting, that first story is a brief story about Pharaoh. This story is more in-depth, and it gets into more of the psychology that's underneath it. It's almost like this narrative about passing your wife off as your sister must have been handed down in multiple ways in Israel's history. But this one seems to have more psychological complexity to it. So let's go through that one. Someone want to read that for us?
Reading chapter 20.
Chapter 20.
Abraham journeyed on to the region of the Negev, where he settled between Kadesh and Shur, while he stayed in Gerar. He said to his wife Sarah, she is my sister, not his wife Sarah, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are about to die because of the woman you Abimelech, who had not approached her, said, O Lord, would you slay a man even though he is innocent? He himself told me, she is my sister. And she herself also stated, he is my brother. I did it in good faith and with clean hands. God answered him in a dream, yes, I know you did it in good faith. In fact, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. That is why we did not let you touch her. Therefore, return the man's wife as a spokesman. He will intercede to you, that your life may be saved. If you do not return her, you can be sure that you and all of yours will certainly die.
So-
Early next.
Yeah, someone else want to continue?
So Abimelech rose early next morning, and summoning all his servants, told them the whole story, at which the men were very much afraid. Then, summoning Abraham, Abimelech said to him, What have you done to us? What wrong have I done that you bring so great a sin on me and on my kingdom? You have treated me as you should not have done. And Abimelech asked Abraham, What possessed you to do this? Because, Abraham replied, I thought there would be no fear of God here, and the people would kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's, and she became my wife. So when God made me wander far from my father's house, I said to her, There is a kindness you can do me. Everywhere we go, say of me that I'm your brother.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Someone else want to continue that? It's good to have different voices.
And Abimelech took flocks and herds and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he restored his wife Sarah to him. And Abimelech said, Here my land is at your disposal. Settle wherever you please. To Sarah he said, I hereby give you your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This will preserve your honor before all who are with you, and he will exonerate you before everyone. Abraham then interceded with God, and God restored health to Abraham, to his wife, and to his maidservants, so that they bore children. And the Lord to close every wound in Abraham's household in the account of Abraham's wife Sarah.
All right, so you see kind of the depth of the psychological narrative here. Well, I was afraid, So you get Abraham's motivations, you get Abimelech finding out, from a dream from the Lord, I'm in big trouble now. And you get Abraham being enriched in the end, so it's very interesting. Second king, second deception. Now go to Genesis 26. Read that narrative a third time. This time with Isaac, but the same king. He doesn't seem to learn very quickly. All right, so verses 1 through 11. Someone want to read that for us?
Now there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and will bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give to your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, She is my sister. For he feared to say my wife, thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me for the sake of Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac fondling Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is your wife. How then could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought, lest I die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall be put to death."
All right, so we get episode 3 of one of the patriarchs passing his wife off as his sister. So it's
Like
very
father, like
interesting.
son?
Yes, like father, like son, exactly. Yeah, he learned from his father, but it's the same king. He didn't learn very much, did he? So, okay, so interesting narratives. And again, the scriptures don't hesitate to show us, in a sense, the guile and cunning of Abraham. So now let's go back to chapter 13. And this introduces us to the story of Abram and Lot. And if you read through this little section, I'm going to just sort of summarize it for you. You get something of the greatness of Abram and the selfishness of Lot. So they get to divide the land up, and Abram graciously says, "You pick whatever the land you want." And Lot looks around and picks what he thinks is the best land, the most fertile part of the land. And Abram says, "Okay, I'll take what's left." And he goes up to the mountains. And the Lord then tells Abram, "Look around you. I'm going to show you the land that you're going to receive." So you get something about the greatness of Abraham in that story with Lot, and also about how Lot's thinking about himself. Now, as the biblical narrative unfolds and all of Israel knows the story already, you know that Lot really didn't pick the best land. It just looked like good land then, but he picked an area where Sodom and Gomorrah are. And so when you hear those names in biblical history, what do you think of? Bad places. Those are bad places. He picked bad places to move to. So dark, destructive places. If you go, by the way, to, how many of y'all have been to Israel, been to the Dead Sea? So what does it look like down there by the shores of the Dead Sea? It's a salty, waste, empty land. It's got scorched by fire. It's not a kind of place you would want to settle and live. So that's where Sodom and Gomorrah were, south of that Dead Sea, or the Sea of Salt. So it's kind of today it's a very forbidding place. And it was also a very forbidding place by the time the narrative was written. So Abram got, in fact, because of his generosity of not choosing the best, he got the best in the end. So then in chapter 14, I don't know if you read through that chapter is sort of an interesting chapter. There's a big battle between 5 kings and 4 kings, and Abram gets involved kind of as a warrior. So you see something of sort of a foreshadowing of someone like a King David, and is very successful in combat victory. And then there's a little tiny figure that shows up here that never appears again in the Old Testament, but gets referred to in the letter of Hebrews in the New Testament, which is this mysterious figure in verse 18, Melchizedek. So the name Melchizedek, Melchi is king of Zedek, righteousness or justice. But he's also the king of Shalom or peace, Salem. And he brings out bread and wine to Abram when Abraham wins the battle. And being a priest of God Most High, by the way, you notice that phrase, God Most High? Typically, the text has this reference. We often translate it God Almighty or God Most High. It's referring to God, the God of the mountain. So, place of where the covenant was made, which was the name often connected with the patriarchs before God revealed his personal name to Moses. So he blessed Abram with these words, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your foes into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So 1/10 of all of Abraham's belongings are given back to Melchizedek the priest. And so Israel's tradition of tithing, giving 1/10, is also connected with this mysterious figure. Now in the New Testament, and again, we look back with Christian lenses at these ancient stories, we see a foreshadowing of Christ himself, who uses bread and wine at the Last Supper. So Melchizedek becomes kind of a foreshadowing figure of Christ, the new high priest. So that's the Christian dispensation, looking back at that ancient mysterious figure.
In verse 14, they talk about going as far as Dan. Is Dan?
So, yeah, Dan is,
way up north?
it
where
is, that's the
River
biblical,
Jordan
yeah, that would
starts?
be what you would call the northern boundary of God's people.
And wasn't Dan the name of the area where the mouth or the source of the River Jordan?
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, yes, Dan is up near where Caesarea Philippi is in that area. I had a great map here, if I can find it. Oh yeah, Dan is way up in the north. In fact, in this map in the Jewish Study Bible, Dan is looks even further north than what we call Caesarea Philippi, but I'm not sure about that because this map doesn't have enough detail. But it's the northernmost frontier of Israel. And Beersheba is the southernmost, so you're near the phrase from Dan to Beersheba, from north to south, which is down near the Dead Sea. Dan is at the border of Mount Carmel, and that is where Caesarea Philippi is. So that's where the springs of water come down.
When we were in Israel, it was like Jordan is derived from the River Dan, Jordan. Because that's the headwaters of the Jordan.
Beyond the Dan, or beyond the Jordan, right? The Jordan, Jordan is beyond Dan, right?
I don't know what, I mean, I know that in Jordan, in the word Jordan, the Dan comes from Dan, supposedly.
Yeah, there's some connection there,
Yeah.
that's right. I forgot that.
Oh, but it's a town, Dan, that's to the north.
It's a location,
Yeah.
but that's also where one of the tribes ends up.
I got a question. How do you interpret the last part of that thing where he's discussing business with the king of Sodom? What is that all about? From the 21, after Abram gives him a tenth of everything, then the king of Sodom said to Abraham, "Give me the people, the goods you may keep." Is there something, is that significant, or should we just forget about it?
That, Jim, I do not have an answer for. I'll have to see what I can find out. But it does seem to be, you're talking about verses 21 and following?
Yes, actually 21 and following,
So it looks like Abram is saying, I'm not going to take your stuff except what my servants have used up, and the share that is due to the men who joined me. Let them take their share. So it looks like Abram is not concerned about getting stuff for himself, but for the men who needed what they needed.
Or is he rejecting the king of Sodom in general?
Well, it's sort of like saying, I don't know my wealth to you. I'm not dependent upon what you gave me. You're going to say that I got rich because you gave me all this stuff, but I already had my stuff, so I don't need your stuff. All right, chapter 15 is another fascinating chapter. And this one you probably recall because it does show up in one of our Sunday reading cycles. And this is one of the, so Abram has numerous encounters with God, where God renews the promise or makes the promise to Abram. And in this one, this is the one where he cuts the animals in half, and then the mysterious symbols of fire and smoke go between the animal parts. And in the ancient world, sometimes when they made a covenant, a commitment to parties, they would say, okay, I promise to do A and B for you, and you promise to do B and C, and they would cut the animals in half and walk between them. And the symbolism was, if I don't keep my bargain, then you can cut me in half. So that was kind of the symbolic value of that ritual. So when Abram has the vision, it's not Abraham who is asked to go between the animal halves, but fire and smoke are symbols of God himself. So what God is saying is, Abram, I will be faithful to this covenant, or I will allow myself to be cut in half. So God is making, in a sense, a sacred promise to Abraham in this very ritual way that the ancient people would understand.
This is where he tells them, he predicts or prophesies that they'll be enslaved for 400 years.
Yeah, where is that? What verse?
13.
Know for certain, yes, that your descendants shall be aliens in a land not their own, where they shall be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But he's giving Abraham a foreshadowing of the whole thing. But I will bring judgment on the nation in a servant. In the end, they will depart with great wealth. So God is not only promising Abram offspring and a land, but he's also, at this point in the narrative, revealing to Abraham what is to come in the journey of God's people. And then verse 18, to your descendants I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Many of those groupings of people will appear again and again in the first 5 books of the Bible, referring to the land of Israel.
We get the birth of Islam in chapter 16.
The birth of Ishmael. Yeah, sometimes people trace that to the Arab communities and thus to what will later be areas that become Islamic. But that's certainly not in the text at this point, right?
It's in the Quran.
It's a Quranic reinterpretation of the biblical text, right? So we were talking about how the texts get reinterpreted by Christianity. So that is also the case with Islam. They will look back at the ancient narratives and see them through a new interpretive lens. So, but, again, this is sort of an interesting narrative when you read it. It's not what we would do in the modern world, right? So Abraham has been promised that he's going to have an offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven or the sands of the seashore. But what's the problem? That Abram and Sarah have not been able to have a child yet. So Sarah decides to take things into her own hands and says, why don't you basically have Hagar, my maidservant, and you can have a child through him, and that will be the way we'll, continue your progeny. So how well do you think that's going to work? So,
As soon as she has her own, then she throws the lady and the baby.
yeah. And even here, the jealousy happens because it says that she begins to look down upon her mistress. So once she's had a child with Abraham, she starts looking down at Sarah, and Sarah feels that. There's some rabbinic story that says there are 4 things at which the earth shudders, and one of them is when the servant despises her mistress. So that's one of the things that causes the earth to shudder in the rabbinic tradition. It's like not respecting your elders. Kind of. Yeah, it's interesting, and one of the things that you do see, by the way, in this narrative, you see God's careful concern for Ishmael and Hagar. It's really quite beautiful, actually, and you see it in the text more than once. It's sort of like, and there are elements of the promise that were given to Ishmael that were sort of reflective of the kinds of promises that God makes to Abraham, but not fully. So there's a sense of God's expansive heart that is bigger than simply the people he has selected for his own, which is Israel. Would someone like to read that? Number 2, chapter 16. Can't do all of them out loud, but some of them are worth jumping into.
Abram's wife Sarah brought him, had borne him no children. Now she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. Sarah said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from bearing children. I have intercourse with my maid, perhaps I will have sons through her." Abram obeyed Sarah. Thus, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, his wife Sarah took her maid Hagar, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. He had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. As soon as Hagar knew she was pregnant, her mistress lost stature in her eyes. So Sarah said to Abram, "This outrage against me is your fault. I myself gave my maid to your embrace, but ever since she knew she was pregnant, I have lost stature in her eyes. May the Lord decide between you and me." Abram told Sarah, "Your maid is in your power. Do to her what you regard as right." Sarah then mistreated her so much that Hagar ran away from her. The Lord's angel found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the road to Shur. And he asked, "Hagar, maid of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She answered, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." But the Lord's angel told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority. I will make descendants so numerous," added the Lord's angel, "that they will be too many to count." Then the Lord's angel said to her, "You are now pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heeded your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Alongside all his kindred shall he encamp." To the Lord who spoke to her, she gave a name, saying, "You are God who sees me." She meant, "I have really seen God and remain alive after he saw me." That is why it is called Beersheba. I can't pronounce that. It's between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham named the son whom Hagar bore him Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old, and Hagar bore him Ishmael.
All right, so you see the tender regard of God in sending the angel to comfort Hagar, and you also see the promise that God will greatly increase the offspring, that there'll be too many to count. So that's the sort of the echo of the kind of promise made about Isaac. And the play on names, Ishmael, meaning God heeds. God pays attention. He notices.
Who are the slaves? Where did they come from? The Abraham's slaves? Abram's slaves?
Well, this particular slave girl is Egyptian, so presumably they got her when they were in Egypt. So in the ancient world, there was also a tradition of slavery. Slaves were not, this is not the same as chattel slavery when African peoples were taken as lifelong property. So slaves in those days could be redeemed by someone else. In other words, you could pay a certain amount and free them. So it was more like a blend between a servant and a slave. So part of your household that did the work for you, but they also they had a place to stay and food and so forth. All right, the next one, of course, is the beginning of the sign of the covenant. So we've been hearing about the covenant that God makes with Abraham. The promise of God to Abram is offspring and land, but now we're going to hear about the sign of the covenant. And the sign of the covenant, of course, in this case, is circumcision. So on the 8th day, every male child shall be circumcised. So that's the beginning of the sign of the covenant marked on the flesh. Just as Noah had the sign of the bow in the sky, now we have and you also have the requirement that basically houseborn slaves and those acquired with money, they also have to be circumcised. So Abram at this old age in his life is going to be circumcised. And this also, I think, is where Abram gets renamed Abraham and Sarai gets renamed Sarah.
What was the point in renaming?
Often renaming means a new purpose or a new mission from God. So God is, in essence,
They generally say why.
kind of a new mission. You know, you're going to be more than we prepared you to be. And this is where the name Abraham, you'll get not just the father of a multitude, but a father of a multitude of nations comes in. And verse 17, this is kind of the first reference to laughter. So when Abraham and Sarah finally do have a baby boy, they will name him Isaac, which is a play on the word laughter in Hebrew. And there are several different places where this idea of laughter comes up surrounding the birth of Isaac. So verse 17, Abraham prostrated himself and laughed as he said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old, or can Sarah give birth at 90? And Abraham said to God, let Ishmael live on by your favor." So God is going to make it clear to Abraham and Sarah that the offspring as numerous as the dust of the earth and the stars of heaven are not going to come through Ishmael, but through their own baby boy, Isaac. So this is the promised son, as it were. Now, I think chapter 18 is also a profound chapter, and this one shows up in Christian iconography a lot. So someone want to read that one for us?
The Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent and heated the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked. Behold, 3 men stood in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth, and said, "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, wash your feet, rest yourselves under the tree, while I fetch a morsel of bread, you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. While Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, my husband anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah shall have a son. Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. She was afraid. He said, no, but he did laugh.
All right, so that's one of the most powerful stories, and it's a lot of beautiful motifs. In the ancient world, hospitality was one of the most important things you could do. And so when Abraham sees these strangers in the desert, he knows that they were sent by God, and he runs out to greet them, and he says, let me just do a little bit for you, but in the end, he really puts out a huge feast for them. He treats them very well. And these are actually messengers from the Lord who now promise Abraham and Sarah that a year from now they're going to have a baby son. And that's when Sarah starts laughing. And I like the Jewish Bible translation because it says, shall I in truth bear a child old as I am? Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah will have a son. And this is more straightforward in this translation. Sarah lied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was frightened. But he replied, you did laugh. So, very interesting. So for us, and again, we as Christians look back to these narratives and we say, why were there 3 visitors? So for us, those 3 visitors become a symbol of the Trinity. So when you find some ancient icons, one of the famous ones is of these 3 strangers at table. So on one side, you have one of the strangers, you have one in the middle, and one on the other. And the 4th side is open toward the viewer. And they symbolize the 3 visitors to Abraham and Sarah, but they also represent for us the Holy Trinity. So we see the Father to the left, the Son looking directly at the viewer, and the Holy Spirit to the right. And the Son and Spirit are inclining their head toward the Father in deference. And the 4th side of the table is left open, inviting us into the unity of that feast with the Trinity to become part of God's life. So we've taken this scene from the life of Abraham and Sarah, and we look back at that as a glimpse into the Trinity as Christians. So again, a reinterpretation, just like Islam sometimes reinterprets these ancient texts.
100 years has changed a lot since the early times when people lived to be 600 or 800 years old.
Yeah, Abraham hasn't gotten to that historical epic of being only 120 being your upper limit yet. So, yeah, he's still, was 100 when Isaac was born and Sarah was 90. Yeah, long past that. Her womanly periods had stopped, is what the Jewish Bible says. So, now the interesting thing is, these 3 visitors will now head down to Sodom. So the next episode is one of the most dark stories in the book of Genesis, and also the story that follows it with what happens with Lot and his daughters. So we'll come back to that next week because we're now at the 8 o'clock hour. So this is kind of our first glimpse into some of the stories about the ancestors, and in this case, the beginnings, Abraham and Sarah. You have the feeling that many of these stories about Abraham and Sarah were handed on individually. So you have these episodes, they have episodic qualities that have later been woven together into this narrative. Do you get that sense as you're reading them? In that sense, they're sort of many of them are kind of almost standalone stories, and in some ways they are a retelling of promises already made. So different ways of expressing that same fundamental encounter with the mystery of God, who has made promises to Abraham and Sarah for his offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands of the sea, and this land I will give you, to Abraham and Sarah. All right, so we do have some questions. Yes? Yes?
Just back to chapter 17, the circumcision covenant. in light of the fact that God says to Abraham, every male among you will be circumcised, blah, 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 what is the Catholic Church's position on circumcision? Like, I mean, when I have a son, am I obligated to have him circumcised? That's what the Bible says. That's what God said to Abraham.
Jewish tradition.
All right, so
Well, I know it's a
you have
Jewish
just now
tradition.
entered right into the heart of the New Testament and the whole debate that early Christianity had surrounding circumcision. And there were early Christians who said you have to be circumcised to be a Christian. And it was Paul who said, no, Christ is the circumcision now. It's by his dying and rising. So if you want to read Paul's reflections on that very question, you can look at his letter to the Galatians.
Okay.
So yeah, there's some pointed language in there on Paul's part.
What chapters do you specifically want for March 1st?
All right, so we do not
Two
meet.
weeks.
Yeah, we do not meet next week because Myler comes back next week. So it's 2 weeks from tonight that we'll meet again. And yes, continue if you haven't read. Continue on with Genesis through the stories of Abraham. So go at least through chapter 25. I don't know if we will get as far as Jacob and the narratives about him, but if you wanted to read further, you could go all the way up to 36, which would take you into Jacob. By the way, the stories about Isaac are very slim. So Abraham is this big figure. He has Isaac, and Isaac will have Jacob. But Isaac almost disappears from the text. Well, wouldn't you if your father tried to kill you? So it will slaughter you on the fire until the angel of God intervenes. So, any other questions that came to your mind as we were going through that before we do our breakouts into small groups?
I thought it was interesting that Abraham told Sarah, you deal with Hagar. It's almost like,
Yeah.
if mama ain't happy, nobody.
Yes.
He just-
Yeah, you do it if you want to. Yeah, he likes Ishmael. He doesn't want to do it, but okay, she's in your power.
He could be patriarchal in society, and yet he doesn't exert any authority there, he just defers to Sarah.
Do you think maybe Sarah has more power than the patriarchal culture recognized? The shadows of that are in the story. Maybe Sarah maybe has
Females
something.
probably had the power in the household over the female slaves.
Oh, definitely over their
So
female
that
slaves,
would relate
yes.
back to that would be why Sarah was in charge of Hagar.
Correct. But that Abram would say, yeah, do whatever you
Do whatever
want.
you